So Shabbat Chanukah always falls upon one or two Torah portions. Either it's Vayeshev, which is the beginning of the story of Joseph, which we read last week. Joseph with his many colored ornamental cloak and all of the rivalries with his brothers. Or Shabbat Chanukah can fall on this Sabbath, which is called Miketz, which begins with Genesis 41. It's all about the dreams of Pharaoh and why Pharaoh was so upset and anxious and discombobulated about the world. The beauty or the power of this Torah portion is simply that Joseph is pulled out of slavery. He emerges as a masterful storyteller and a masterful interpreter of dreams. He has the humility and the wisdom to say to Pharaoh, after he gives great interpretation, the answer didn't come from me. The answer comes from God. The answer comes from the Almighty. That's an amazing statement in which he repeats many times in these chapters. So as we have lit these 6 candles of Hanukkah tonight, I'm reminded that the inspiration and the light of the world comes not only from the Almighty, but it also comes very profoundly from our own people. Think about the light that Jews have brought to this country. The light of creativity. All of the musical, artistic, scientific geniuses of the last of the last century, and all of the Nobel Peace Prizes that they have garnered since the 1920s. Think of the light of justice that illuminates our country. It began in the 1920s with eminent jurists like Cardozo and Felix Frankfurter, the 2 first Jewish Supreme Court justices who led the way during Roosevelt's administrations. And the light of moral clarity that has shone upon us for years and years, one great example being Rabbi Heschel back in the 1960s. He was the first rabbi who was asked to go and speak to the Pope. He had the chutzpah, or the strength of character, to speak to Pope John and demand a change in Catholic theology. He also stood with Martin Luther King and civil rights leaders, remember, in the early 60s and 65, 66, in many places and many avenues in Alabama when his life was endangered. So we have brought so much light to this nation. And now I observe and I feel that the light is a little bit diminished. We are a little bit nervous. I personally am nervous. We're reminded that we stand in a very precarious time in history. The leadership of Jewish communities around the world, I think, are reeling from what happened last Sunday. Alex Ribchin, who's the leader of the Australian Jewish community, described it precisely. He wrote a long guest essay in the Times a few days ago. He said, "Our lives will never be the same." And then he lamented in this article that Australia is not the same Australia that it was 10 years ago. You know, when you and I think of Australia, we think of gorgeous beaches, the Sydney Opera House, the beauty of the people, that special accent. But antisemitism has grown and permeated Australian society, unfortunately, to an extreme degree over the last 5 or 6 years. Mr. Ribchin wrote the following: "The last 2 years have demonstrated how fragile our position in Australia truly is. When a mob assembled at the Sydney Opera House on October 9th in 2023, 2 days after the Hamas army attacked Israel, that mob reveled to make fun of the Jewish community in the midst of our suffering, of our sorrow at what had happened on October 7th. And they chanted at the Sydney Opera House, "The army of Muhammad will return," among other threats. The Jewish community knew that those threats were real because in the previous year or two, two restaurants in Australia in the Sydney area had been firebombed. A synagogue had been attacked and firebombed, and many other Jewish businesses had been desecrated. He said, "What did the government do for us?" Instead, he said, the government dithered around, uttering bland condemnations, calling for general calm. And then finally in 2024, the Albanese government appointed a special envoy to, quote, deal with antisemitism. And Jewish leaders in Australia at that time, this is only a year and a half ago, pleaded with the government to not only have a nice conversation, have conferences. What do conferences mean? They said to the government, you have to do something in a physical, muscular way because people are going to be killed. The strategy was never formally endorsed by the Australian government, let alone any kind of specific anti-Semitic proclamations were made in the country. And thus we see the sadness and the horror of what we all witnessed and saw on television last Sunday. The one light that came out of that horror and that massacre was an extraordinary outpouring of humanity by a wonderful Syrian Muslim man who realized that someone on that rooftop or on that high point was shooting down at all of these innocent people on the beach. And he had the courage and the power to attack that gunman and knock him down and throw him down and wrestle the gun away from him and ultimately stop him from firing, in the midst of which he was shot himself, as you know. But this was truly an extraordinary light of courage and humanity. But the Australian government, as I'm just recounting to you, the people in the Jewish community were basically saying, what did you do over these last 2 years for us? How were you going to go about protecting us? If not, at least the Israeli government told the Australians, there are dangers in your communities. The Iranians are planting people to ultimately attack Jewish institutions, and the Australian government did nothing. So this week, I was, as you may know, I was on KSFR, had a wonderful conversation with Reverend Talitha Arnold. She's the leader of the church over there, the United Church at Arroyo Chamiso. And one of the first questions that our interviewer posed to me, which kind of threw me off, and I thought, are you kidding? But he said, well, why has anti-Semitism become such a graver, much more serious and apparent, pervasive problem in this country, in the world? And I wanted to say, are you looking at the news? Are you reading anything in this world? Are you aware of what's going on in our country, in the fallout from the war in Gaza? My simple answer to him was, part of the reason for the rise of anti-Semitism in America is there has been such an extreme demonization of the state of Israel and a denigration of Israel's right to exist, that people think that all Jews are 100% behind Israel, and therefore Jewish people need to be, hit upon. They need to be reminded that they're not so good. That if you support Israel, you're doing something not so, maybe not in the best interests of America. And so I spent some time during that podcast or during that interview explaining that most of us are not Israeli citizens. We don't vote in Israeli elections. Our opinions are our own opinions. We may or may not like the government, this, that, and the other, but the point is that we have to stand up for the right of Israel to exist. Zionism is a positive place, has a positive place in American society. Zionism basically says Israel has the right to exist as a sovereign nation. So when you go over to Paseo Peralta on any given Friday and see all of those very noisy protesters against the Jewish people screaming, Israel is genocide and Israel has done this, and from the river to the sea, let them be free. You have to understand what they're saying is they don't believe in the right of the state of Israel to exist as a sovereign nation. And that is a very anti-Semitic statement. They certainly have the right to express their political opinion, but I don't know how else to explain that statement other than that based on profound ignorance and lack of understanding of history. But yet, that is just one barometer of why the anti-Semitism has grown and manifesting itself in this country. I also pointed out in the interview that anti-Semitism just didn't emerge suddenly de novo in the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, we as the Jewish people have been dealing with people who don't like us and have thrown rocks and more against us for the last 2,500 years. Even 100 years ago in the 1920s, there was a tremendously powerful anti-Semitic climate in the States, partly because there had been so many Jewish immigrants who came to America from 1881 to 1920, and partly because, remember, the Ku Klux Klan had an incredible resurgence after World War I, and they were marching around in the South and even in Washington, D.C., basically saying, death to Catholics, death to the Jews, death to the blacks. And then I said to Jim Falk, remember Jewish history. We've been dealing with those who hate us going back, as I said, think about what happened when the Jews were thrown out of England in the early 1200s. Think about the Inquisition. Think about the Cossacks in the middle 1600s rampaging through Poland and the Russian-Polish border, slaughtering tens of thousands of Jews. Think about the Kishinev pogroms of 1904 and 1905. Some of our grandparents left Russia or Kiev at that time to escape those pogroms. So we've been dealing with this illness, with this pernicious illness for centuries. How do we deal with it today? I pointed out that in Santa Fe, life is very nice. It's halcyon. People like us. The only time I hear people say unkind things or that, well, they're afraid to say to my face, what they really believe. But sometimes when I'm at the tennis courts, I hear from various tennis partners, well, what's wrong with Israel? And what's going on in Gaza? And why has Israel killed so many people in that war? And on and on and on. That's just what I call a little bit of the illumination on the surface of what a deeper question is. In fact, when I was at the ministers' meeting last week, I thought, why is it that so many of these ministers never wrote to me or called me up or said anything to myself or Rabbi Amswich after October 7th? I remember only 3 of my colleagues in this city reached out a hand or reached out a voice and expressed their sorrow and the dismay after the October 7th calamity. And this week, as a matter of fact, after the slaughter in Australia, only 4 ministers, 4 colleagues, all of whom I have great respect for, and I kind of expected them to pick up the phone or write to me. But there's something like 50 or 60 ministers in this town, not to mention all the Catholic priests who, by the way, don't even want to participate in our Interfaith Leadership Alliance. That's a whole nother question. What I want to say to you is we have to strive for the light. We have to reach for more brightness, for more strength through the light of not only learning, but the light of our tradition. You know, Hanukkah, if you think about it, today, Hanukkah, a very nice Gentile person asked me the other day, well, what do you do? What kind of presents do you get? What kind of fun things do you do for Hanukkah? I said, Hanukkah is really, first of all, it's kind of a secondary holiday for us. I said, it's not about presents. It's about freedom of religion. I said, the reason we have Hanukkah is we were able to remember who we really are. In the midst of battles in the 2nd century BCE, I was telling this gentleman, in the midst of fighting against the Greco-Roman or the Greco-Syrian army, what we wanted to do was preserve the core values of being a Jew. The freedom to pray, the freedom to observe Sabbath, the freedom to go to a synagogue and congregate, the freedom to circumcise young boys, which the Syrian procurator had said was against the law. Hanukkah is about embracing our essential Jewish values: study, community, mercy, kindness, and justice. Doing the right thing, holding onto our moral compass. That's what Hanukkah is about. It became commercialized, as you know, thanks to American businessmen. And also because some of the best Hanukkah songs were, of course, composed by Jewish composers. But what I want to remind you of, and I want you to feel good about, is Hanukkah reminds us of the best of who we are. We are people who believe in the light of God. We believe in moral justice for everyone in our society. We believe in the right to express our opinions, even if our opinions are totally different from someone else's. We believe in the importance of caring for the sick and the homeless and those who are less fortunate than ourselves. And that's what Hanukkah is about. The freedom to be who we are and the freedom to enjoy our community and not worry about what may happen in next month or the year to come. I hope you embrace those freedoms as well. One footnote to this spiel. One of our congregants, Tony Brenner, has suggested strongly that we should all get together at various times in the coming year and sit down and talk about Israel. I mean, if I asked all of you what's your opinion about Israel today, I'm sure we'd have at least 20 different opinions right now. So he said we need to talk about how do we understand Israel? How do we support Israel or criticize Israel? What does it mean to be a devoted Jew and still be able to criticize Israel about certain things? He said also we need to talk about things because there are anti-Semitic, what I would call currents or rivulets floating through Santa Fe in various ways. They may not be as obvious as one would see in New York or Detroit or Baltimore or whatever in the big city, but they exist here in this town. And he suggested that we have a series of conversations and just share our ideas and our feelings and also and maybe our worries about all of this. And it'll help all of us feel a little bit stronger as a community. Shabbat Shalom.